The photograph was captured at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a cool Saturday in September 1875, somewhere on the stretch of land between Manchester and Liverpool. In front of the camera stood 37 people, frozen in time. Some balanced high above the ground on wooden poles, almost 5 meters up, while others stood below in perfectly straight rows, dressed in their colorful show costumes. There were acrobats, strongmen, flexible women who could bend like ribbons, dwarfs, towering giants, and small children whose faces were painted in bright patterns. Behind them, the circus tent rose like a great ship, majestic and proud against the dull gray sky of Victorian England. To an ordinary viewer, this might look like just another old photograph of a traveling circus troupe. But hidden behind that image is something much darker, something no one could have imagined. 6 hours after that moment was captured, every person in the picture would be dead, not one would survive. The story of how that happened remains one of the strangest and least explained tragedies of the Victorian era. The group called themselves Godfrey's Grand Menagerie and Curiosity Show, a daring mix of traditional circus acts and human curiosities, the kind that fascinated Victorian audiences. The owner, Silas Godfrey, was not some cheap carnival trickster. He had spent 15 long years touring across England, Scotland, and parts of Wales, slowly building a reputation as a clever businessman who knew exactly what his audiences wanted. Shock, wonder, and the thrill of seeing something beyond ordinary human experience. The troupe had around 40 members, though the number changed depending on temporary hires and replacements. Among them were the main acrobats, a family of 6 Polish brothers and sisters known for dangerous stunts that made crowds gasp. There were also 3 so-called giants, each standing between 2 meters 20 and 2 meters 40 tall, likely suffering from what we now know as pituitary gigantism. Then came the Siamese twins, 2 Irish siblings joined at the chest, sold by their struggling parents when they were still small children. One of the most famous performers was Constance Fairchild, called the Elastic Woman, who could twist and fold her body into shapes that seemed to defy nature itself. Her abilities were probably caused by what modern medicine calls Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, though no such name existed back in 1875. And then, of course, there were the children. Victorian freak shows always had children, some born into the circus, others bought, adopted, or even stolen, depending on which story you choose to believe. In the photograph, at least 6 children can be seen, their ages somewhere between 5 and 12. Their expressions are strangely similar. None of them smile, none fidget or laugh the way normal children do. They sit or stand in still silence, with that eerie discipline seen only in those raised to be watched, to perform, not to live. That September night was supposed to be routine, nothing unusual. It was just another stop on a tour that had already lasted 3 months. The troupe had set up their tent in a rented field near a small industrial town, though records disagree whether it was Wigan or Warrington. This confusion about the exact location would later make investigations even more difficult. The tent itself was large for its time, about 30 meters long and 20 meters wide. Its heart was a tall oak mast, almost 15 meters high, surrounded by a web of steel cables and thick hemp ropes that anchored the whole structure to the ground. Iron stakes were hammered deep into the soil to hold it steady. It was no careless setup. Silas Godfrey had invested heavily in strong materials because he knew his fame relied as much on safety as on spectacle. The weather that day had been unpredictable. According to records from the Royal Meteorological Society, September 1875 brought stormy conditions to much of northwest England. Cold Atlantic air met warm continental winds, creating unstable skies. During the afternoon, while the photograph was being taken, the sky was gray but calm. No rain, no heavy gusts, nothing to cause alarm. Typical weather for that part of England. The show was planned to start at 8 o'clock that evening. Tickets had been sold all week, advertised in local papers and posted in taverns and busy streets. Prices ranged depending on where one sat: 3 pence for the side benches, 6 pence for better seats, and a full shilling for the front rows, usually reserved for the middle class. To give perspective, an average factory worker earned between 15 and 20 shillings a week. So attending the circus was an affordable but still special treat for most families. Records and reports suggest that around 250 to 300 people gathered that night. Families, groups of young workers, and small-town shopkeepers looking for a night of wonder and distraction. The air buzzed with excitement. Vendors wandered among the crowd selling roasted chestnuts, sweet candies, and cheap beer. Children darted between seats, and men smoked pipes as they waited. It was an ordinary night of laughter and anticipation in an England that worked hard and dreamed harder. But hidden in the wooden bones of the tent was a secret, one that no one could see. Weeks after the tragedy, investigators discovered the cause, a fracture in the central oak mast, about 3 meters above the ground. The crack had formed over time as moisture seeped in and rotted the core. From the outside, the pole looked solid, but inside it was decaying, a silent weakness just waiting for the right pressure to snap. The performance began right on time. Silas Godfrey took the stage, his deep voice filling the tent with the kind of drama and charm that made him famous. He began with the acrobats, the Polish siblings whose graceful flips and swings on the trapeze always drew gasps and cheers. The crowd clapped wildly, mesmerized by the light and motion. Everything was going as perfectly as it always did. Then came the human curiosities. The giants stepped forward to display their immense height. The elastic woman bent herself into shapes that seemed impossible. The Siamese twins stood quietly while the audience whispered in fascination. Even the children were brought to the center, each one presented as a living oddity, part of a carefully rehearsed show meant to amaze and disturb. Every act followed a strict script, blending entertainment with the illusion of education, pretending it was all for science, not profit. Around 9:45 that night, the wind began to stir. At first, it was just a few restless gusts that made the tent flap lightly. No one paid much attention. Circus tents were built to handle worse. But what was coming wasn't an ordinary wind. Later meteorological reports would classify it as a microburst, a sudden, violent downdraft that hits the ground and spreads out with incredible force, sometimes faster than 150 kilometers per hour. People who were outside later described how the sky seemed to collapse. The clouds thickened into a deep black. Lightning flashed, cutting jagged lines through the darkness. The temperature dropped suddenly, and then came the wind. Not as a gradual breeze, but as a violent wave of air that smashed into the ground like an explosion. Inside the tent, people first noticed the noise. The canvas rippled violently, ropes tightened with sharp, twanging sounds, and the metal stakes began to creak. Some performers glanced upward, sensing danger with the instinct of people who live under canvas roofs. Silas Godfrey, always calm before his audience, continued speaking, though witnesses later said his voice trembled slightly. The oak mast groaned. It was a low, heavy sound that could be felt through the wooden floorboards. Those nearest to the center felt a faint vibration beneath their feet. And then, almost too fast to react, the sound deepened, a splitting crack that echoed through the tent like thunder. The hidden crack, now strained under massive side pressure caused by the winds tugging fiercely at the upper cables, began to spread. The wooden fibers started to snap at a microscopic level, setting off a chain reaction of structural breakdowns that grew at an alarming pace. Then, at precisely 10 hours and 3 minutes that night, the mast gave way. It wasn't a clean or silent break. It was a violent and explosive collapse where every ounce of tension stored in the cables and tent frame released all at once. The mast splintered apart, throwing sharp oak fragments outward like deadly missiles. The steel cables, suddenly freed from their central anchor point, lashed across the interior space of the tent with terrible power. The heavy canvas, soaked by the downpour and weighing over 2 tons, came crashing down over everyone inside. What followed in the next few minutes remains partly unclear, pieced together later from the physical remains and a handful of witnesses who were outside. No one within the tent survived to tell the story directly. What can be reconstructed suggests that a perfect storm of destruction took place. Shattered wood, whipping metal cables, collapsing framework, and the suffocating mass of the canvas combined into one horrifying disaster. Those who happened to be close to the exits may have had only a few fleeting seconds to react. Some likely tried to run for safety, but under the sudden darkness, trapped beneath the heavy soaked fabric, and overcome by panic, their final chances vanished almost instantly. The canvas didn't just fall upon them. It wrapped around bodies, folded over itself, and trapped air in tight pockets that disappeared fast. Outside, the fierce wind continued to twist and pull at the collapsed structure, making any rescue attempt utterly hopeless in those first moments. Residents from nearby homes who rushed toward the field described the scene as something out of a nightmare. The once bright and bustling tent was now nothing more than a vast heap of dark fabric, thrashing wildly in the storm. The sounds of people screaming could still be heard, faint and muffled beneath the canvas and the deafening roar of the wind and rain. Many from outside tried desperately to lift the canvas or tear it open, but its immense weight and tangled shape made the effort nearly impossible. With each passing minute, the screams grew fewer, then weaker, until at last there was only silence and the sound of the wind. The storm itself lasted around 40 minutes before it began to fade. When the winds finally calmed enough for rescuers to organize and act, the damage had already been done. It took several painstaking hours to cut through and remove the sodden layers of canvas and dismantle the wreckage in order to reach the victims beneath. What they uncovered was beyond what any living person could have imagined. A total of 317 lives had been lost. Every member of Godfrey's troupe, every spectator who had come to see the show that night, no one within the tent had survived. The causes of death varied widely. Some had died from severe head trauma caused by flying wooden fragments. Others had been struck or crushed by snapping steel cables or the collapsing framework. Many suffocated beneath the thick, soaked canvas, trapped in airless spaces. The majority of the bodies showed multiple fatal wounds, making it nearly impossible for coroners to determine the exact cause for each. The devastation was complete and absolute. The response from local authorities, though swift by Victorian standards, could do little to ease the horror. A coroner was summoned at first light, and county police soon arrived to secure the area. Telegrams were urgently sent to Manchester and Liverpool, calling for additional help. But the magnitude of the disaster far exceeded what a small industrial town could handle. There was no morgue large enough to contain so many dead. There were not enough coffins or even enough men to dig so many graves. The officials had to find a grimly practical solution. A nearby field was quickly consecrated and turned into a temporary burial ground. Common graves were dug side by side. The bodies were covered in sheets whenever fabric was available. When it ran out, they were placed as they were, one after another. Efforts were made to record the identities of the victims, but many faces were too damaged to be recognized. Small personal items became the only clues left behind. Pocket watches stopped at the hour of collapse. Wedding rings that had once symbolized love, children's toys, rosaries, and trinkets that now marked the remains of entire lives suddenly extinguished. The town was left in shock. The once vibrant fairground had turned into a field of mourning. Families who had attended for laughter and light found themselves standing in the cold rain, searching for names on hastily written lists. The circus that had arrived full of color, animals, and music was gone, leaving only ruins, grief, and unanswered questions behind. Reginald Chamberlain, the coroner in charge of the official investigation, produced a 43-page report that still lies preserved in the National Archives in London. His document is careful in its description of injuries, exact in its technical study of the tent's collapse, yet strangely quiet in certain areas. There are notable gaps. Some parts of the report use language that becomes vague, hesitant, almost evasive, and there is a confidential appendix sealed by court order, kept hidden from the public for 50 years after the event. Why such secrecy? What could be so sensitive that it needed half a century of silence? The reasons appear slowly when one looks at side documents, private letters, and early newspaper pieces that were printed but then quickly withdrawn. There were details about the tragedy that the Victorian authorities found deeply uncomfortable, even dangerous for public stability. The first issue was the matter of responsibility. Who was legally answerable for the loss of 317 lives? Silas Godfrey was already dead, removing the most obvious person to blame. But investigations revealed that he had hired local builders to help assemble the massive tent, and those men had also perished. The timber for the main mast had come from a supplier in Liverpool, who claimed that checking its quality was the buyer's duty. The officials who had granted permission for the show insisted their authority covered only paperwork and licensing, not safety or construction. No one wanted to accept guilt. Everyone pointed to someone else. Another problem was the social makeup of the audience. Among the dead were several well-known individuals from the area, a local magistrate and his wife, a pair of successful merchants, and the son of a clergyman. The presence of these respectable people at what society called a freak show, a form of amusement officially frowned upon by Victorian morals, caused deep embarrassment. Families did not wish to admit publicly that their relatives had been there. They preferred silence to the shame of public confession. Even more disturbing was the evidence showing that panic had played a large role in how deadly the disaster became. Injury studies showed that many victims were crushed not only by falling beams and canvas, but also by the crowd itself, as terrified people pushed and trampled each other trying to escape. Near the exits, bodies were piled high. Children had been stepped on, elderly people knocked down and left. This raw panic, this collapse of decency in the face of fear, clashed violently with the Victorian belief in order, reason, and moral strength. In his private notes, Chamberlain wrote something that never made it into the official report. He recorded that several performers had died in ways suggesting they were protecting others. The strongman was discovered curved over 3 small children, his own body shielding them from deadly blows. Constance Fairchild was found lying across an elderly woman, seemingly trying to create breathing space beneath the fallen tent. The Siamese twins were intertwined with a group of people, their arms extended as if trying to hold up the collapsing canvas. None of these details were released to the public. They did not suit the accepted idea that freak show performers were degraded people exploiting their own misfortune. The truth, that they showed courage and compassion, contradicted the prejudices of the time. In the days after the tragedy, a few short newspaper stories appeared. The Manchester Guardian printed 3 paragraphs. The Liverpool Mercury printed 5. Then the story began to fade. Within 2 weeks, coverage ended almost completely. This silence was not because the public had lost interest, but because authorities quietly pressured editors to move on. There were whispers that too much attention could lead to stricter rules for all public entertainments, which would affect theaters, music halls, and other circuses. Wealthy business owners preferred the incident to disappear, and Victorian society, with its obedience to power and class, generally agreed. The families of victims received little help. Charity drives were arranged, collecting modest sums. Some received £5, some 10, roughly 2 to 4 months' wages for a factory worker. A meaningful amount, yet far from enough for such loss. Purcell Davenport, one of the acrobats who died that night, left behind a widow and 4 children in London. His wife was granted £7 and 6 shillings from the charity. It sustained the family for about 3 months, after which she had to send 2 of her children to an orphanage and find work in a textile mill. Her experience was typical of poor families in that era who lost their main provider. Robert Fairchild, Constance's younger brother, lived only because he had fallen ill that day and stayed at a local inn instead of performing. At 16, he lost his sister, his companions, and his livelihood. Records show that he tried performing alone afterward, but failed. In 1878, his name appears in the records of a Birmingham poorhouse, and by 1882 he vanishes entirely from history, likely dying without record. The field where the disaster occurred was left untouched. No new building was ever placed there, and no memorial stone was set. For years it remained open land, sometimes used for grazing sheep. Locals avoided it, especially at night. As time passed, ghost stories grew, voices in the wind, moving shapes in the fog, strange lights. These tales, as they often do, became a way for people to deal with collective grief. In 1923, almost 50 years later, a businessman decided to build a warehouse on that ground. While digging the foundation, workers found bones, many bones. The mass graves from 1875 had been poorly marked, and nature had erased all signs of them. Work stopped at once, archaeologists were called, and the remains were carefully exhumed and reburied in a proper cemetery. A small stone was placed there, engraved simply, in memory of those who perished in the Circus tragedy, September 1875. The photograph you are now seeing was discovered in 1967 in a trunk of family papers belonging to descendants of the photographer who took it. It was stored with glass negatives, invoices, and casual letters. No one in the family knew what it represented until a local historian, while researching Victorian entertainment, matched the names written in the photographer's notes to victims of the tragedy. That was when the truth became clear. This image is not just a group photo of circus performers. It is the final record of 37 people, taken 6 hours before they all died. Every face in that picture, every stance and smile, belongs to someone unaware they were living their last day. The woman in the second row, third from the left, was to be married the following week. The tall man standing at the back had already purchased a ship ticket to America. The child in front had just begun learning to read. All those futures, all those hopes, were wiped away in 40 minutes of chaos and wind. The story of the 1875 disaster remains mostly forgotten, not because it lacks evidence, but because it was deliberately hidden. It revealed things Victorian England did not want to confront: how money, pride, and class shaped whose lives were mourned and whose were ignored. The performers of freak shows occupied a strange space in that world. They were both famous and despised, admired and mocked. When alive, they were curiosities that drew crowds. When dead, they became mere numbers on a page. The tragedy exposed this hypocrisy clearly, which is exactly why it was silenced. A letter still exists in the Home Office archives, dated October 1875. It came from a Manchester police officer, writing to his superior in London. He stated, "It would be wise to discourage further press investigation. The incident, though unfortunate, involved mainly individuals of doubtful social standing. Continued discussion will only unsettle the public without real benefit." The letter was never officially sent, but its survival proves such thoughts were common among officials. This attitude shows an ugly truth about Victorian values. A society that took pride in progress, decency, and Christian virtue could also measure human worth with cruel precision. Performers were seen as lesser people, their deaths less worthy of sorrow, their families less deserving of aid. Yet if you look again at that photograph, do not see curiosities or outcasts. See human beings. See the acrobat who faced his fear of heights every day. See the contortionist whose joints hurt constantly but who smiled on stage. See the children who played between shows who dreamed of faraway places. See their full humanity. The disaster of 1875 was not only the collapse of a tent. It was the moral collapse of a society that allowed 317 souls to vanish without proper memory. By remembering them now, by speaking their names and recognizing their humanity, we perform a small act of justice. When the storm ended that night and silence fell over the ruined field, something essential had changed. Not laws, not policies, not attitudes, they stayed the same, but something inside the hearts of those who had witnessed it. They knew then what many had ignored, that Victorian civilization, proud and certain, was as fragile as the tent that fell.